Welcome to my channel. We recap new manhwa. If you like, so please share and subscribe this channel. When Cheonhao opened the bathroom door, Lujinian came into her sight, just having finished his shower. He was dressed in pajamas and was sitting on the bed, the side that he usually slept on. With both hands behind his head, he rested, eyes closed. Cheonhao averted her gaze before even catching a glimpse of his expression. Lowering her lashes, she walked towards her vanity table. The table had a mirror that faced the bed. Every time Cheonhao looked into it, she could catch brief glimpses of Lujinian. Initially, she stole only quick peeks, but after confirming that Lujinian never once opened his eyes, most likely asleep, she dared to admire him quietly in the mirror. Lujinian's face was imprinted into Cheonhao's mind. She could remember every detail distinctly even with her eyes closed. Ever since the first time they met 13 years ago, she had never stopped getting butterflies just by looking at his face. With his eyes shut, Lujinian seemed to be less cold. The frosty aura that he seemed to emit had also dissipated, softening his features. Mesmerized, Cheonhao forgot to apply her facial cream, causing it drop on the floor. Even if it was just a one-sided crush, just being able to watch him up close like this was enough to spread joy and warmth to every cell of her body. If his eyes were open, Cheonhao would have never dared to look straight at him like this. She often fell into a trance, mesmerized by his looks, and that could easily expose her feelings for him. Cheonhao's features softened, turning gentle as she continued staring at him. Impulsively, she lifted her hands, caressing Lujinian's reflection, starting from his eyes, then moving to his nose bridge, and stopping on his slightly pinkish lips. The memory from 3 months ago resurfaced, the feeling of when she had kissed those lips. Even though it had been 3 months, the memory was still crystal clear. She remembered everything, his soft warm lips. Cheonhao's heart rate quickened, her fingers continuously stroking the reflection of his lips. But just as she was about to sink into her own one-sided love universe, a phone suddenly rang, indicating an incoming message. Lujinian furrowed his brows, seemingly annoyed by the disturbance. Momentarily shocked, Cheonhao instinctively retrieved her hands back. She suddenly thought of something and rushed towards the changing room. Carrying a human-sized teddy bear, she walked out. Cheonhao returned to the bed with the huge teddy bear. Lujinian lifted his head impassively, sweeping over her with a frosty glare. Cheonhao's heart thumped uncontrollably. Not even daring to breathe, she clutched the teddy bear tighter and hurriedly made her way to her side of the bed. She placed the bear in between her and Lujinian, separating the two of them. Only then was she able to relax. She took a deep breath and slowly found a more comfortable position in the bed, hardly daring to move. She had bought the bear after got married and had shared the same bed twice. Every time she got too close to Lujinian, her heart would beat rapidly. Afterwards, she would get helplessly nervous and anxious. The very first time they had shared a bed, her posture was very formal and stiff. But when she fell asleep, having relaxed slightly, her posture started getting haywire. Unconsciously, she had reached over and touched Lujinian. That night, he had pushed her away aggressively. The second night, he had pushed her off the bed before leaving the room. After that night, she realized the extent of his hatred. Even if it wasn't intentional, he found her touch repulsive. In order to prevent such an incident from repeating itself, she specifically bought the 1.8 teddy bear the next day. And the next time they shared a bed, she placed the teddy bear between them to prevent any unintentional touches through the night. The bedroom was dimly lit, causing one's vision to be blurred and hearing to be enhanced. Cheonhao lay on one side of the bear with both eyes shut. But she wasn't able to fall asleep. She could clearly smell the fresh scent coming from Lujinian, which squeezed her heart. Cheonhao could clearly hear Lujinian as he occasionally tapped his phone, producing a soft sound. After some time, he locked his phone, slipping the room into complete silence. It was so quiet that she could hear his every breath. Cheonhao had lied down too quickly. Even though she was in an uncomfortable position, she didn't dare to move much. Carefully, she turned, changing into another more comfortable position. Regardless of how cautious and small her actions were, she had still managed to disturb Lujinian. He turned suddenly, flipping over vigorously. Frightened by the fierceness of his actions, Cheonhao lay motionless, not daring to move. Lujinian seemed to be in a bad mood. He tossed and turned as though something was frustrating him. Cheonhao was unable to sleep either as she focused on him who was turning around restlessly. Suddenly, Lujinian yanked his blanket aside, sitting up fiercely. Xiao Anhao trembled in fear, shocked by his furious actions. Not daring to open her eyes, she remained motionless. Vaguely, she heard footsteps and the flicking of a lighter. Gradually, the faint smell of cigarettes drifted over, filling the room. As far as Xiao Anhao could remember, Lujinian was not a smoker. This was the first time since they married that he had smoked in front of her. She couldn't help wondering where he'd learned to smoke and when did he start. Lujinian sucked in 2 long mouthfuls before glancing over at Xiao Anhao, who was lying silently, and the teddy bear beside her that was larger than her. Straight-faced, he turned his head. He walked towards the balcony and pushed open the windows. After finishing his cigarette, Lujinian waited for the smell to dissipate fully before closing the door. He then walked over to the bedside. This time, after lying down, he no longer tossed and turned. Without Lujinian's constant movements, Xiao Anhao was still nervous, but the huge teddy bear in between them as well as her fatigue overcame her. Gradually, she began to relax, slowly sinking into a deep slumber. Xiao Anhao didn't know for how long she had slept when suddenly she felt someone roughly grabbing her hand. A mind-numbing pain spread through her entire body, and Xiao Anhao furrowed her brows, slowly opening her eyes. Just then, she saw Lujinian sitting by the bear, staring at her coldly. "Trying to seduce me when I'm sleeping again," he snarled. Xiao Anhao's fatigue left her. She blinked her eyes with curiosity before lowering her head. She realized that she had unknowingly stretched beyond the teddy bear into Lujinian's side. She tried to shrink her hand back instinctively, but Lujinian clenched it tighter, not allowing her to escape. With a tone laced in ridicule, he asked, "Why? You want to sell your body for another role now that the previous one is over?" Xiao Anhao paled at Lujinian's ridicule, her face bleaching white. After the incident 3 months ago, his impression of her had gone down the drain. He wouldn't even listen when she tried to explain, ignoring the hurt. She whispered, "It wasn't intentional." "Not intentional?" Lujinian laughed sarcastically, frost clouding his eyes. His snide remark next was merciless and cruel. "Miss Chiao, I never expected your lies to be as good as your ability to take advantage of others. That day, I'm pretty sure it was you who climbed into my bed when I was drunk, and if I don't remember wrongly, you were pretty enthusiastic, even begging me to sleep with you." Lujinian's words pierced Xiao Anhao's heart, each word seemingly cutting deeper and deeper, leaving her eyes red. That night, she had indeed begged him. But she too had drunk alcohol. Slightly tipsy, mistaking it for a dream, she had asked softly, "Can I be your woman?" Xiao Anhao had never expected Lujinian to use the events of that night to mock her. Her face flushed a deep shade of red. Humiliated and shamed, she pinched herself. Only when the pain from her fingertips overshadowed the pain inflicted by Lujinian's words did she calmly explain herself, "I had no intentions of seducing you, I was asleep when I accidentally touched you. It better be the case. But get this straight, even if you were the one that started this game, from now, I'm the one in control. You can indeed gain benefits from me with your body, but that's only when I'm interested in sleeping with you." Lujinian paused, then with arrogance soaking his every word, he continued mercilessly, "If I'm not interested, I won't lay a finger on you even if you throw yourself at me like the first time." With Lujinian's every word, bit by bit, the blood drained from Xiao Anhao's face. She continued to hang her head, not daring to look at his expression. When Lujinian finished, he coldly released Xiao Anhao's wrist and went to the changing room. When he came out, Xiao Anhao was still on the bed, in the same position as when he had left her. She looked fragile and thin, and with her head hung low, she looked like a student being punished. When the dim lights hit her, she looked young and innocent. Lujinian stood by the changing room door, quietly staring at Xiao Anhao. After a while, his eyes lowered. He turned and left the room. Some time after Lujinian had left, Xiao Anhao slowly lifted her head, staring at the side of the bed that he had been lying on. Moving the big teddy bear away, she buried her face into his side, breathing in his scent, feeling the warmth he had left behind. Xiao Anhao took in a deep breath greedily before caressing the blanket that still carried his warmth with her face, bitterness spreading through her heart. Even if he had said such cruel things, she still couldn't help being in love with him. Yesterday night at To the End of Time banquet, Zhao Meng had been right. They were never like this in the past. Back then in school, Lujinian was generally quite close to the guys, but he would avoid girls at all costs. And at that time, she was one of the few girls that were on speaking terms with him. However, he talked to her not because she was special but because of Su Jiamu. The Su family and Chia family were very close, and she had grown up with Su Jiamu. Lujinian was Su Jiamu's half-brother of the same father, which meant that Lujinian was the legitimate son of the Su family. Not affected by the problems from the previous generation, Lujinian and Su Jiamu had a close relationship and got along well together. Xiaoanhao had become one of the girls that spoke with Lujinian through Su Jiamu. However, they were only on talking terms which primarily consisted of greetings out of courtesy such as hello and goodbye. Back when she was younger, without so much worries, she would always actively pursue her love. Even though she wasn't the kind of girl who could daringly confess to a guy, write love letters, or deliver chocolates at Valentine's, she would secretly look for him. Occasionally, in the school field or on the way home, she would catch up to him, greeting him casually while suppressing her feelings. He would either reply with a greeting or just nod his head, but that was enough to leave her basking in happiness. More than once she had dreamed of a future with him, but she could never muster enough courage to confess. As such, their lukewarm relationship persisted, while her feelings hidden deep within her heart grew each day. After she entered university, for a reason she did not know, Lujinian started to treat her with hatred and disdain. Initially, she had thought she was too sensitive because of the love she harbored. One day, Su Jiamu accidentally told Xiaoanhao that Lujinian had someone he liked. So the next time she had bumped into Lujinian, she couldn't help asking him who that girl was. Even though Lujinian had shown signs of irritation to her several times before, it had never been like that day. Even after so many years, she could still distinctly remember that moment. With a forbidding expression, he snarled, "Why would you care who I like? It definitely isn't you." That was when she finally understood that Lujinian must really hate her. Even though she never found the reason for his hatred, from that day onwards, she started to avoid him. Just as she had told Zhao Meng, they stopped interacting from that day onwards. The few times when they had met, there wasn't much talking, and whenever they were forced to talk, his words were always hurtful. Because of her deep love for Lujinian, Xiaoanhao paid attention to his every word. Because of her deep love for him, he could easily hurt her vulnerable feelings. Over time, she started to fear his presence, fear interacting with him, for every time he spoke, his words would trample all over her heart. She always thought that as long as they didn't interact much, the two of them would just part ways, becoming strangers. One day, though, fate dramatically forced them to become a couple. Only the heavens knew how happy she had been when she realized that they were going to get married. She was fully aware that Lujinian hated her. That's why on their wedding night, she had made it clear to him that she would not interfere or affect his life, and neither would she let others know about their relationship. Because of her love for him, that night 3 months ago, she had seduced him with the help of alcohol. He must have really hated me a lot to have been that angry after sleeping with me, she mused. It was never her intention for him to think that the role was her aim, but she had had no choice. She could only use a materialistic and cheap image to explain her actions. Because he had once said, no matter who he likes, it wouldn't be her. Tears welled up in the corners of her eyes as she relived the moment he'd said that. After Lujinian left, Xiaoanhao didn't fall asleep till daybreak. For the next few days, she didn't see or hear from him again. The three of them, Xiaoanxia, Su Jiamu, and Lujinian, were of the same age. Xiaoanhao was younger than them by 2 years. To allow the two sisters to go to school together, the Qiao family had forced Xiaoanhao to skip 2 years in elementary school. The Su family and Qiao family didn't live too far away. On many occasions, Su Jiamu, Xiaoanxia, and Xiaoanhao would go home together after school. During junior high, Su Jiamu and Lujinian liked to go play football in the field after school. Xiaoanxia would usually stand by the field screaming for Su Jiamu to go home. They were only in junior high at the time, but Xiaoanhao and Xiaoanxia were already quite popular with the guys. In private, people called them De Qiao and Xiao Qiao. De Qiao, since Xiaoanxia's personality was very fiery and outspoken, whereas Xiaoanhao was comparatively quiet and peaceful. The two sisters were considered pretty. Xiaoanhao was naturally more beautiful, but Xiaoanxia's personality drew people's attention. And so, every time Xiaoanxia screamed for Su Jiamu to go home, people would whistle and scream De Qiao. Xiaoanxia would arrive at the field with Xiaoanhao alongside. Though everyone was whistling and screaming at her, Xiaoanxia never blushed. Yet, Xiaoanhao, who stood behind her, would always secretly blush. When he first noticed it, Lujinian had the ball in his arm. In his heart, he couldn't help but chuckle and silently make fun of her. They're screaming De Qiao, so why are you, Xiao Qiao, blushing so hard? But at that time, he never asked himself what Xiaoqiao's blushing face had to do with him. Perhaps he had already noticed her back then. The young man's heart struggled to understand what love was or what it meant to be moved. He only knew that after playing football after school every day, he would see her and feel relaxed. When he didn't see her, it felt like something was missing. For over half a year, he had always silently paid attention to her. Then, on one heavily rainy day after school, he finally actually got close to her. At the time, he carried an umbrella and was about to pull it out from his school bag when he saw her carrying her school bag over her head and running over to a shelter under the roof of a house. He didn't know what came over him, but he pushed the umbrella back down into the bag and followed her under the roof. He was listening to Jay Cho at the time, but he turned off the music as he stood next to her. With earphones in his ears, he heard the pitter-patter of raindrops. From the start, he never turned to look at her once. To be honest, he was a little nervous. It was not until the rain had died down and he was getting set to leave that he turned to look at her. As he turned, he found that she was staring straight back at him. In that instant, his heart picked up, and he quickly diverted his eyes, bolting away. After that, he got close to her again on their first day as new high school students. In reality, he didn't want to go to that high school. The tuition was a little expensive, and at that time, he had already spent all of his late mother's savings. However, when he found out through Sujamu that she would be attending that high school, he pawned off his mother's jewelry and used all the money he earned working in the summer to pay off a year's tuition. That day new students had to report to school, so he purposefully stuck with Sujamu. When Sujamu introduced them, he really wanted to say his name but out of habit he just coldly nodded. Sujamu gave her his name instead. At that time, it counted as both of them officially recognizing one another. To the very least, when they bumped into each other, she would say hi, and he would nod at her or sometimes, he would say her name. Naturally, his favorite place was the school field. Every night when he would play football, he saw her and her friends in the field running. Yeah. Actually, there was another secret people didn't know. That field was where the guys got together to judge who was the school's most beautiful girl. He didn't vote for her. However, in the end, she was chosen as every guy's most beautiful girl in school. At the time, he was happy but also distressed. So many other guys also thought that the girl he had his eyes on was the most beautiful. Later, he heard that they would be splitting the class depending on their results in science and arts. When it came time for the end-of-term examination, he left the last big question at the end of the math paper completely blank. There was no helping it, that was what he got for falling for a girl with bad grades. All in all, the idea was there, but the results were terrible. Who knew that out of nowhere, she would turn into a black horse getting into class 1. He, on the other hand, ended up in class 3. That day when the class was divided, he was in an awful mood. He laid in bed that night tossing and turning, unable to fall asleep. With a headache from the lack of sleep, he entered the classroom the next day to find a pink envelope in his drawer. It made his mood worse. A week later during break, he and a few guys went to the school's snack shop where he bumped into her. However, she didn't notice him. She carried a lot of snacks. Just as she was going to pay, she suddenly blurted, "I forgot to get a small bun." When he heard those words, he walked straight up to the food section. He stood in front of a selection of different buns, until she would come over like they'd met by chance. At the time, he stared at the bread but from the corner of his eye, he paid close attention to her. Who knew that when she clearly said small bun, she actually ran off to the sanitary goods section. She stared at the flowery packages for a good long time before grabbing a sanitary towel and leaving. Sanitary towel meant small bun? Till now, he still didn't get the correlation. The longest time that they had ever spent alone was when he left the washroom once. He caught her resting on the wall, pale-faced, clutching her stomach. She looked like she was really in pain, and so he sent her to the school's nurseroom. As a whole, that was the most perfect afternoon of his life. It was a bright sunny day. She lay there on the bed not too far from him. He looked like he was reading but all he was thinking about was her. Later, a female classmate came over. After that, Xiaoanhao said a few words to him. Just as she was going to leave, she actually asked him if that girl before was his girlfriend. Did she misunderstand him? He hurriedly cleared things up. For someone who rarely spoke, after he cleared things up, he further explained why he was speaking to her in the first place. Secretly, deep down, he thought that after the class event finished, it would be best if he and this female classmate never spoke again. Truth be told, he never could be bothered by that female student. That afternoon, although it was the most perfect afternoon, at the same time, it was his most shameful afternoon. Because when it came time to paying for the medical fees, the bill came to $28. He reached out for 30. He'd earned that 30 that weekend under the bright sun handing out leaflets. But she casually opened her wallet to reveal a thick pile of hundreds. That was a year of his wages and more. Truthfully speaking, that was when he started to think about how he could work hard to make money. Just like what the male broadcaster said, love can't be measured by money, but without money, love would be impossible. For him, becoming a better person was to be able to love her. Furthermore, he loved that version of her, the girl who didn't come from an ordinary family, but a wealthy one. Truthfully speaking, he wasn't much of a talker, so he didn't enjoy hanging out with classmates. But every time Sujamu went out, he would call her, so he would go regardless. It goes to show that it was a good idea to go out, because later, he found out that she wanted to go to university in Hangzhou. Hangzhou was so big, and there were quite a few good universities. She didn't mention which one she wanted to go to, but even if they didn't go to the same university, at least they'd be in the same city. Hence, when the SAT scores came out, he applied for 3 universities in Hangzhou without any hesitation. Facts have proven, there's no such thing as the worst, but there's the worst of the worst. Though she said she was going to Hangzhou, she actually stayed in Beijing. From then on, they lived in 2 separate places. When he left for Hangzhou, Sujamu asked why he didn't stay in Beijing. All he could say to brush him off was that he was scouted in Hengdian to shoot a movie. Back then, he was in a terrible mood up until she, Sujamu, and even Xiao Anxia came to Hangzhou. That was also when he learned about the luxurious life she lived. No matter if it was what she used or what she wore, it was expensive. Back then, their stars weren't aligned in the slightest. He felt immensely pressured. After that, she would often go to Hangzhou, and with every trip, he would treat her to a meal. At the time, she never knew that there was a poor man who scraped his wallets to pay for her bills. Nor did she know that one meal of hers was a month of his pay. On his 4th year of university, when his acting career was picking up, he received a text from her saying that she'd lost her wallet and was alone at Hangzhou South Station. At the time, it was heavily raining in Hengdian. He didn't even change out of his clothes before renting a black car and rushing over. Xt. That night was the first time in their lives where they shared a room. That night, she slept well with a smile on her face, while he had to hide in the bathroom a few times in the middle of the night. That night, she didn't know it, but he secretly stole a kiss. After the kiss, he said deep down that he would take responsibility for it. When Lujinian's car entered the city, it was still raining heavily, but he no longer dared to continue reminisce about the past. At her birthday party, Song Xiangxi asked him who Qiaoanhao was to him. He hadn't replied. If he were to reply now, Qiaoanhao. She was his deep, forbidden love. When Jinyan's car entered the city, it was still raining heavily, but he no longer had the courage to continue recalling things from the past. Song Xiangxi had asked him what Qiaoanhao was to him. He hadn't replied. If he were to reply now, Qiaoanhao. She was his deep, forbidden love. If he were to go back in time, back to the time of his memories, and someone were to ask him who she was to him, he would say that she was his deepest love. However, somehow, along the years, that love had become forbidden. From the day he had noticed her to the day they had hid under the deserted home for shelter, to the day she was officially introduced to him by Sujamu, to the day they shared a room, he had been trying desperately to improve himself. He had always believed that to love someone was to protect them from the world and not let them suffer with him. He entered the entertainment industry when he was 18 years old. With a total of 4 years, he went from the substitute to the side character that no one paid any attention, to finally the 3rd male lead. In the entertainment industry, not only females were humiliated, males were too, especially one with such an exceptional-looking face. Not just women, even men tried to keep him as a paid lover. He had always been blunt, offending the rich and powerful, thus often getting ostracized and pressured. Those 4.5 years were the most difficult time of his life, but yet, it was also his most blessed. No matter how hard the situation, as long as he remembered that he was working for his one true love, he would willingly plow through any situation. The last time he had sent Qiaoanhao out of Hangzhou, he had given her all his money. At that time, his new drama was about to air, and even though he was just the 2nd male lead, he was a favored character. He strongly believed that with this role, he would officially open himself to the industry. When he had watched Qiaoanhao queue up, He had still been thinking if the love he had harbored for so many years could finally materialize the next time they met. However, life would always throw surprises at you. In the end, he managed to take over the industry with that role. Every alley and street was filled with his news, and the success that he had been striving for was well in his hands. But somehow, his seeking for love, it all changed from there. Thank you for watching.